I thought, what in the world am I doing at this talk? So the first hypothesis I generated was that maybe I was an amateur historian. And you know, one of the things you learn when you're trying to teach something is just bloody well how little you know about it. And so I started to dig more deeply into the history of the Balfour Declaration. You know, I could give a pretty credible 20-minute presentation on the history of the Balfour Declaration, but it didn't sit well with me because it isn't the right thing for me to be talking about. It's not my area of expertise. And to say anything about the political situation, like anything definitive, it's like, that just seemed like absolute hubris. You know, I mean, there's so much going on in that little corner of the world that for me to take a position of solution on it just seemed absurd. And I thought, okay, well, I'm no historian and I don't have any answers, so where in the world does that leave me? One of the questions that he raised, not explicitly, precisely, but implicitly, but evidently was, like, who cares? Why is this so important? Why is this little ratty part of the world that's like just scraped out of useless desert, fundamentally?
The spiritual leader of the ultra-Orthodox Shah's party, Rabbi Obadiah Yusuf, has wished death for all Palestinians and the acting Palestinian Authority Chief Mahmoud Abbas. Speaking during his weekly sermon, the ultra-Orthodox rabbi described the Palestinians as evil people who should perish from earth. He told his followers that God should strike Palestinians with a plague.
Why in the world is everyone obsessed with it? You know, and it's really something. It's always struck me. And so I thought, well, maybe that was something a psychologist could talk about. You know, one of the things that struck me when Ezra was speaking is that, you know, maybe even the enemies of the Jews perversely respect them because they've done so well in the Middle East that it's just annoying. Hey, like, you know, you don't want to be thinking that success is necessarily going to attract admiration, right? I mean, we know from the Cain and Abel story that success can attract murderous resentment and the desire to destroy. And so that's just one of the problems, I think, is that in some ways Israel is a shining beacon on the hill. And of course, in some ways, I suppose it's not. But at least in part it is, and that's something, especially in that God-forsaken part of the world. So where there's very little sign of anything resembling the city of God should be ruled. And that's where the problems come, I suppose, because, as you all know, the devil, and in this case, probably literally so, is always in the details. Well, so what are the problems? Well, one of them is that people lie all the time about exactly what's going on in Israel and why they're on one side or the other. You know, they lie because they're malevolent, because they want destruction, because they're jealous, because they're anti-Semitic, because they're anti-Islamic, because they're anti-Christian, because they resent success. That's a big problem. And then there's another problem. It's like, well, it's the problem of the victim versus the oppressor, right? And it's always victim versus oppressor. That's the thing that's so awful. And I see that from a psychological perspective too, because if you think of yourself as a victim, then you don't think of yourself as an oppressor. Well, then you've got it wrong, man, because you're victim and oppressor at the same time. But it's way easier to separate the world into the victims that I'm defending, you know, and hopefully don't have to be in the same category as, because that would be, you know, then I can have my cake and eat it too. And all those terrible oppressors out there that aren't me. And, you know, that's a psychological divide, because if you're such a fool that you think you're only victim and not oppressor, then there's so much you don't know about humanity and society that well, I don't even know what the proper metaphor for that is. You haven't even begun your journey to wisdom. Let's put it that way. That would be the right way to think about it. And so, you know, the whole victim versus oppressor, the horrible victim versus oppressor mythology can be laid out again in the Israeli state, and then it depends on who you want to make victim and who you want to make oppressor. It's exactly the perfect situation for that, because you can look at the historical catastrophes that assaulted the Jewish people, which are absolutely undeniable, or you can take the side of the Palestinians. Take your choice. You can do your moral virtue signaling on both sides of the argument, and so that's extraordinarily convenient, especially if you don't have anything else to do. So And that, that ties into the problem of virtual signaling, because it's also very convenient for people who want to develop a sense of their own advanced morality to take on the problems of some distant state and wave their bloody banners and their protest signs in favor of the hypothesis and proposition that they're on the side of the moral right. So that's all I have to say about that. Problem number 2 for me, and again this may be a consequence of my ignorance, which I'm trying to rectify. Muhammad was a warlord. And I don't know what to do about that fact. Like, one thing you can say about Christ, hypothetically, let's say, I'm not talking about a historical reality necessarily, although I'm not denying it either, is that of all the things he was, warlord was definitely not one of them. And I don't know what to do about that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. And I don't know how to reconcile, like, not only was Muhammad a warlord, which I don't think is an unreasonable thing to proclaim, the expansion that he initiated was unbelievably successful. I mean, within 600 years, it was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it demolished Byzantine Christianity, which is something that Western people don't even know. I've read thinkers who said that the West was so traumatized, culturally, let's say, by the demolition of Byzantine Christianity, that we can't even study it now. And so, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know that it's not true either. And the Buddhists were wiped out of Afghanistan, and we saw that echoed in the Taliban's destruction of those great Buddhist monuments.